Alright, so we're going to talk about Russia and the Soviet Union, which is the national studies part of the syllabus. And yeah, we're going to focus on the period between 1917 and 1941, I believe. So let's start off with an overview of Bolshevik ideology, the October coup, 1917, and the early Soviet government. Bolshevik ideology. The bourgeois are those who own the means of production in a capitalist society. They maintain property and make a profit. They could be described as the middle class. They are not the commodity themselves. They make income off their property, for example, factories, farm, etc. Proletariat. They are wage earners in a capitalist society, at the mercy of their employers, and could be described as the working class. Marxism is a political and economic idea of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marx believes that history shows a pattern of struggle between the oppressed and the oppressor. It makes a classless society. It doesn't account for Russia not having experienced capitalism. This was intended for Germany, England, France, etc. Anyway, Marxism in Russia. Russia Marxists established themselves in 1898 as the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. 1903, this splits into Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. Lenin and his colleagues had a vision of a future communist society, one with no poverty, no state, meaning no repression. Haha, funny, because it didn't turn out like that. People managing day-to-day businesses that kept society functioning. This is a quote from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. 1900s to 1917, Lenin develops his ideas on Marxist theory. 1902, what is to be done? 1916, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. 1917, the state and revolution. 1917, also the April Theses. Background to the October coup. February Revolution in 1917. The Tsar abdicates. This is the end of the Romanov dynasty. Between February and October 1917, Russia experienced a system of dual power. They had a provisional government and Petrograd Soviet of Workers, Soldiers, Deputies. The provisional government dismantled Tsarist apparatus. Growing power of the Soviets severely hampered establishment of an effective political system. Soviet dealt with army, railways, communication, and employers and employees. Provisional government, the authority without power. Ooh, is a quote. Petrograd Soviet, the power without authority. So yes. The Bolsheviks played virtually no role in the February Revolution. When Lenin returned from exile, he challenged the revolutionary dynamic in Russia. Bolsheviks had been supporting provisional government, attempting to reach capitalism so that a communist revolution will happen smoothly. Lenin demanded that this support ceases. Lenin believed he could use the Soviet as a power base from which the Bolsheviks could eventually obtain power. Peace, land and bread became the ideology surrounding Russia. That was pretty much all that was important. They wanted to have good relations with their neighbours, they wanted to eat, and land was integral to communism, so really did support this communist ideology. Lenin published the April Thesis. It was support for the end of the war. The bourgeois phase of the revolution had already occurred, and Bolsheviks must abandon all support from this government. For this government, goal of Bolsheviks must be to win control of the Soviets currently emerging in all major cities and towns. This would bring about true socialist revolution. Since 1917, the provisional government was led by Alexander Kerensky. His government was in decline by October. Peasant land seizures, law and order breaking down, social and economic distress. Most significant mistake was continuing Russia in World War I. Lenin decides it is time to act. took great persuasion. The October Revolution of 1917. Lenin's will ensured the October Revolution would take place, but Trotsky's skills of organization ensured it would be a success. Trotsky persuades Lenin to delay the revolution until the Second Party Congress of all Russian Soviets, so that the new government could be presented to the Congress and claim could be made that the takeover was in the name of the Soviets. Trotsky also coordinated Red Guard units to seize key installations and infrastructure in Petrograd, and sent the Red Guard units into the Winter Palace to arrest members of the provisional government. Lenin announced that power had been seized in the name of the Soviets. How did the Bolsheviks seize power? Failures of the Russian government and continuing economic dislocation of the Russian people. Bolsheviks worked hard to educate the working class for the task which lay ahead, preached politics and fostered literacy and culture, whose sole aim was the successful waging of a class war. Hardline approach attracted the working class. Those who opposed their ideals continued to disregard them as a real threat. The revolution was thus a coup founded on the inability of the government to provide effective leadership and the ability of a small group of people to exploit a situation to its own ends. The early Soviet government, this was called the Council of People's Commissars, or something I can't say, and it had 16 members, was in a precarious position at the end of 1917 and faced a multitude of problems. As a result, they introduced a series of popular measures during the early months of Bolshevik rule. They really needed to win over the Russian people. Corrective measures. They knew the new government would need a strong coercive apparatus if it were to survive. In addition to a popular reform program, they pushed coercive measures. Dissolved the Constituent Assembly after only one day. Opposition newspapers closed down Bolshevik newspaper, which was the Pravda. Various political parties were banned, so that meant no competition, no enemies, no nothing. Purge of the civil service, traditional legal system replaced. Enemies of the people, labelled bursui. Oh my god, that bird. The checker. Oh my god. The checker, the most significant aspect of Bolshevik coercive power, originally intended to be a temporary organization created to deal with opposition. It soon grew. By 1921, it had grown to 100,000 people. It evolved into a massive state secret police force. Brutality far exceeded that of the Okharana. Atrocities during the Civil War, which was the Red Terror. The Red Terror was a period of mass killings for the purpose of political repression from 1918 to 1921. Now, let's discuss the next dot point, which is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Civil War, and the introduction of the new economic policy. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. German troops to move on Petrograd. Lenin demanded peace with Germany, whatever the cost. The Tobel had major impact on internal developments, handed over vast amounts of territory and 62 million people. That's not the right word. Was a further stimulus for the outbreak of war. Bolshevik enemies organized for the sake of the nation and Russian territorial integrity. Many Allied troops remained to help bring down the Bolshevik regime. Civil War lasted from the middle of 1918 to early 1921. Cost Russia nearly 1 million lives. 500,000 civilians were displaced, so it's safe to say that millions were affected by this. The Reds, which was the Bolsheviks, versus the Whites, the anti-Bolsheviks, versus the Greens, which is interesting. These were peasant armies protecting their local areas. Reds, outnumbered and facing intervention from allies, and Whites had experienced generals. Despite this, the Reds emerged triumphant through war communism. To achieve military victory, the army and urban workers supplying the army had to be fed. Extreme economic policies of war communism were introduced. All industrial enterprises nationalized under the Vesenka. Imposition of strict labor discipline. A strict system of rationing brought in class-based. End to the market economy, grain requisitioning. AKA, we have communism, and it's prominent in society now. Well, not now, but then. Impact of war communism. It was successful in terms of keeping workers fed and enabling the Red Army to operate effectively. Some look positively on war communism, believing it looked like the birth of socialism. However, it produced a social, economic, and humanitarian catastrophe. Peasants resisted any way they could, burning crops, killing livestock, etc., which ended up with them getting killed, probably. An intensified Czech violence. First Soviet labor camps appeared during the Civil War, probably getting some of those peasants in there. By 1921, AG output plummeted and large-scale starvation swept many areas. Yep, no, I did get that right. Between 5 to 8 million people died during the famine. The Kronstadt Revolution. March 1921, Kronstadt sailors rose up in revolt against Lenin's government. Demands revealed angered the impact of war communism. Lenin ordered its suppression with whatever brutality was required. Oh my god, I hate cars. Marking a turning point in the party's relationship with the people, as the idealism and genuine link to the proletariat were destroyed. Lenin realized there had to be a change in policy direction. Kronstadt gave birth to the NEP, New Economic Policy. Oh my god, there's a B. Let's just talk about the NEP. It was a principal decision at the 10th Party Congress in March 1921. It was the introduction of the NEP. Oh my god. Alright, let's run out of the room quickly. I got the B out. So at this time, oh crap. At this time, Russia's industrial output was 16% of the 1912 level, mining 29%, oil 36%, and grain 48%. Is that supposed to add up? Anyway, in Petrograd, the birth rate fell 50%, while the death rate increased fourfold. NEP was a partial return to capitalism. This was unpalatable for a Bolshevik ideology, but necessary in the short term. Am I recording? Yes. The impact of the NEP. It was dramatic and immediate. Food began to flow into the city. Shops and restaurants reopened. Famine and starvation began to recede. Peasant opposition ended. Economic revival accompanied by rampant corruption. Private trade fell into the hands of NEP men who made big profits and became the new bourgeois, plus the kulaks. There was a major increase in crime. Scissors crisis, widening the gap between agricultural and industrial prices. What a weird name. As agricultural production increased, there was a consequent fall in the price offered for the goods. Conversely, prices for industrial goods rose because the shortages caused by inefficient production methods and the Civil War. Peasants had to pay more for manufactured goods, yet had a lower income from their own produce. Concerned that the regime would lose peasant support. Again, upturn of economy in mid-1920s stabilised the situation. Overall, NEP did not offer an answer to Russia's long-term development. Overall judgments and key points. Lenin's ruthlessness and Trotsky's military and organizational skills were crucial in the consolidation of power. The NEP was crucial as, despite victory in the Civil War, the Bolsheviks may have been unable to maintain power in the desperate situation they faced in 1921. The consolidation of Bolshevik power saw the movement to dictatorship of the party and away from the claimed dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin was forced to take backward ideology steps leading to centralization, as opposed to the idea of representing the workers democratically, all power of the Soviets. Ideology was of major importance to the Bolsheviks. However, they were always ready to compromise on ideology if practical politics made it necessary. Their prime aim was the maintenance of power. Now we're on to the impact of Bolshevik consolidation of power. The tightening of political control we're going to start with. By 1924, Lenin's death, Russia had become a one-party dictatorship. No longer democratic, the Bolshevik government was becoming highly centralized, bureaucratic, and hierarchical. In 1921, there was a major intra-party division. One of the major opposition groups was the Workers' Opposition. They sought a return to the freer days of early 1918. Lenin didn't approve of this and called for a ban on factionalism. Price of opposition was expulsion from the party. A nomenclature system was put in place. All key party/government jobs allocated by the party, focused on loyalty, not talent. Developed a party elite. 1920s, intellectual critics of the Bolsheviks deported. All publications had to be party approved. Censorship. 1921, execution of 11 socialist revolutionaries. The party tightened pressure on the church. Cheka becomes a GPU led by Felix Dzhirinsky, I guess you could say. Now a permanent organ of the state. They had the power to investigate the political ideas of anyone. Their aim was to weed out party careerists, those lacking commitment, the corrupt and the factionalists. At this point, the party was controlling the Cheka, but Stalin flips this later on. The creation of the USSR. Development December 1922, not development at all. Treaty on the creation of the USSR is signed and Russia becomes the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. 1922. USSR made up of 4 republics. Russian SFSR, Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, Transcaucasian SFSR, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, Ukrainian SSR, and Byelorussian SSR. By 1940, the USSR was made up of 15 republics. Continues to exist until breakup of the USSR in 1919. The death of Lenin, in 1918, Lenin was shot and he survived. He suffered several strokes. Late 1923, he had difficulty moving and speaking, and he had a stroke on the 21st of January 1924 and passed away. Power struggle between Trotsky, Stalin, and other leading Bolshevik figures. This succession. No procedures had been put in place to decide Lenin's successor. In his last will and testament, he made comments about several leading party figures, both positive and negative, but did not decisively indicate one person to assume leadership. One clear opinion in his will was that his growing distance for Stalin had been openly published. Stalin was pretty much doubted. No one thought he was going to be the leader. But we don't know this in the syllabus yet, so let's keep going. Possible leadership candidates. We've got Trotsky. He seemed the most likely. He was charismatic, intelligent, and admired by Lenin. Largely respected for Red victory in Civil War, but he was disliked by many because he was arrogant. Zinoviev opposed Lenin's call for seizure of power in 1917 and had not distinguished himself in the CW. Boss of the Petrograd Party, had strong party support base. Kamenev opposed Lenin's call for seizure of power in 1917 but had Moscow party machine behind him. What? Bukharin. He was popular with party members, admired by Lenin as a Marxist theorist. So if you saw that, and if you had that information, I think Bukharin seems like the most likely. Oh yes, and we also have Stalin. He was the least likely. He wasn't liked by Lenin. He built up a powerful power base in the party bureaucracy. Stalin, under the radar. Power had already moved from Lenin's grasp long before he died. Isaac Dushta, it's spelled Dutschcher, by the way. 2 years after the end of the Civil War, Russian society already lived under Stalin's virtual rule, without being aware of the ruler's name. Stalin had accumulated an enormous amount of power and influence within the party, as by 1922 he had become Commissar of Nationalities, Commissar of the Workers' and Peasants' Inspectorate, a member of the ruling Politburo, the only permanent liaison officer between the Politburo and the Orgbureau, whatever that is, General Secretary of the Communist Party. Important stages in the power struggle. Stalin tricks Trotsky into missing Lenin's funeral. This hurts Trotsky's reputation. Stalin works to appear as Lenin's loyal disciple and begins to establish the Lenin cult. May 1924, Stalin survives the reading of Lenin's last will and testament. This said, oh god, I don't really know. The triumvirate defeat Trotsky at the 13th Party Congress. Trotsky effectively is isolated after this. In 1925, Trotsky loses his position as the Commissar of War. Stalin forms an alliance with the right wing of the party. Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Trotsky accused of forming a united opposition and are expelled from the party in 1927. Stalin turns on his previously, what does RW stand for? Party allies. I don't really know. Following 1929, Party Congress, Bukharin, Rykov, and Tomsky are forced out of the Politburo. End of 1929, Stalin succeeded in becoming undisputed leader of the Soviet Union. He defeated his rivals on left and right. Reasons for the emergence of Stalin as leader of the USSR. Immediate aftermath of the power struggle. End of 1920s, Stalin was in total control of the party. Trotsky was exiled from the SU, other leading figures removed from the Politburo and expelled from the party. Stalin could now fill all key party positions with his own appointments. Stalin was tightening his grip on the GPU. Stalin, the Lenin of today. Emphasis from Lenin cult gradually shifted to the cult of Stalin. Oaths of loyalty sworn to Stalin. Party figures quoted Stalin as well as Lenin. 50th birthday in 1929 was celebrated and declared within the party and throughout the nation as the Lenin of today, as I just said before. Reasons for the emergence of Stalin. Stalin had control of the party through his key positions in the Politburo and Orgbureau as General Secretary. Stalin stayed in the background pretending to be a moderate peacemaker. No one realized he was a serious power player. He outmaneuvered his opponents, playing them off against each other. Locke favoured Stalin rather than Trotsky. Socialism in one country was more appealing to most party members than permanent revolution. This gave Russians a special historic role. Stalin made full use of Lenin's funeral to advance his position. He tricked Trotsky into not attending. He took on the mantle of Leninism to transfer Lenin's prestige to himself. Stalin's personal characteristics and qualities helped him become leader of the party. Stalin was able to appoint his own supporters to key positions in the party. He controlled membership of the party, using his power to expel members more likely to support Trotsky and bring in new members to support him. Stalin was politically very skillful and cunning. Stalin was perceived as dull and mediocre, the grey blur. No one saw him as a threat until it was too late. He was tough, he was ruthless, and determined to protect his power base and make sure that he was not ousted. Trotsky himself was responsible for his own downfall. He had weaknesses that made him unfit for the power struggle. Lenin and Sverdlov died at the right time for Stalin. Trotsky had only joined the Bolsheviks in August 1917 and was not seen as a loyal member of the party, thus many Bolsheviks did not trust him. Many thought he'd become a dictator. Stalin's different positions on the NEP during the mid to late 1920s and his decision to go for rapid industrialization at the end of 1920s were supported by the majority of party members. Less high-minded, more down-to-earth and practical than other Bolsheviks, Stalin was ideally suited to managing the bureaucratic and centralized party that had developed. Trotsky was too high-minded and arrogant and dismissive of his colleagues. He was respected but did not engender affection or personal loyalty. He was seen as the person most likely to cause splits in the party. Stalin's control of appointments and the membership made him a useful ally. Other contenders wanted him on their side because he could deliver votes in the Congress. Trotsky did not go out of his way to develop or build up his power base in the party, and allowed Stalin to erode the one he already had. Stalin was a very loyal party member who was one of the few members with proletarian roots. Stalin adopted policies that were broadly approved by the majority of the Communist Party. He was responsive to the mood of the times. Trotsky did not like getting involved in the drudgery of politics. It was lucky for Stalin that Lenin's testament was not read out, and that Trotsky was ill for most of the power struggle. The nature of the USSR on Stalin. Background. Stalin's political system in the 1930s had traditionally been represented as the classic example of a totalitarian state. Recent research has attempted to place some doubt on the pervasiveness of the totalitarian model as applied to Stalin's Russia. Questions raised about the efficacy of the totalitarian model and its appropriateness for 1930s Russia. Characteristics of a totalitarian state. Since all controlling party usually led by a charismatic leader. All controlling party usually led by a charismatic leader. Other political parties are not allowed. Individualism is subordinated to the will of the nation. And official ideology is promoted by the party, Marxism. The state controls the economy. All aspects of mass communication are controlled, so like radio, television, etc. There exists a system of terror and the police state. The NKVD, terror, lots to say about that. Process of law is corrupted. Moral and ethical codes that are a feature of a liberal democratic state are disregarded. The ideology and philosophy of the party in power are indoctrinated into all levels of society. Stalinism as totalitarianism. Single party leader, only one legal political party allowed. All effective opposition had come to an end after the Civil War. Party banned factions. Stalin had destroyed remaining party opposition by 1929. Religious-like ideology. Cynics might argue Stalin was only about power. Ideology provided justification for Stalin's actions and often served to motivate individuals. The party also wanted ideology to supplant traditional religion. Party led by a charismatic leader. Development of personality cult of Stalin. Successfully presented Stalin as the nation's strong, reliable leader in troubled times. Became the personification of the Soviet state. Public opinion and media communication. Party controlled all media, the press, cinema, and arts. Education was controlled to represent the party line and inculcate the correct thinking. Socialist realism was the only acceptable style for the arts. Media promoted the cult of personality around Stalin. Stalin even had people rewriting the past. State terror. Collectivization achieved through the use of state terror. Industrial workers and managers had to be wary of breaking the rules. The purchase and the terror of the later 1930s shows the willingness of Stalin to hurl the full weight of the state terror apparatus against enemies of the state, real or imagined. Intrusion into individual life, where one worked, studied, and lived was determined by the state. The demands of collectivization and industrialization increased the control with the introduction of labor books and internal passports. The fate of the kulaks speaks for itself. All institutions of the state. By 1930s, the party had come to dominate institutions in all areas of life, ranging from the arts to sport to the Komsomol and armed forces. Participation in activities throughout the country was vetted by party officials, and all organizations had party officials. However, transport links remained limited and unreliable. It was difficult to ensure that decisions made in Moscow were carried out across the country in remote ethnic enclaves. Party organizations far from Moscow had a tendency to act of their own volition. The greater the power Stalin exercised, the more difficult he found it to control the party's institutions. Increasingly became the target of resentment. This was said by James Harris. Soviet citizens were not automatons acting without free will. Many were enthused by Stalin's policies. Though people conformed outwardly, they remained independent thinkers, skeptical of what the authorities said, and indeed took risks in declaring their dissatisfaction with things. This was said by Sheila Fitzpatrick. Overall judgment. Oh my god, I'm not even halfway through the document. In some respects, the most totalitarian of all the regimes may appear to have been Stalin's Russia, since it fulfilled all the categories mentioned. Marxism-Leninism was all embracing ideology, which was used extensively as a social engineering force. This was said by Stephen Lee. Recent research from the former Soviet archives suggests that the regime had worked out effective methods of pressuring society and the party-state structures. Stalin had a strong grip on power and the implementation of important decisions. Economic transformation under Stalin. Collectivization. The background. In 1927, they were facing a potential economic crisis. There was an inefficiency of exports, a lack of industrialization and lack of capital to increase industrialization. Price of industrial goods were high and agricultural goods prices were low, led to the scissor crisis. The NEP was not producing the capital that was needed for industry to expand. Two possible solutions: increased taxes and lower grain prices leads to kulaks producing less grain and serious food shortages. Lower taxes and increasing grain prices leads to prevention of food shortages and less capital available for industrialization. Industrialization was imperative, but Russia needed increased capital to achieve this. Stalin initiates the plan of collectivization. Peasant farmers would be forced into collective or state farms. This would make possible the use of modern technology, which would greatly increase the output of grain, which would then be sold internationally. Stalin knew that there would be political gains. He would be able to remove right-wing opponents, he would gain full political support of the countryside, and he would destroy the class of the kulaks. The process unfolded as follows. Committee took everything from the kulaks. The kulaks responded with passive resistance to extreme violence. Stalin implemented a man-made famine to wipe out the kulaks in Ukraine. Results: collectivization was simultaneously an absolute disaster, a massive human tragedy, a political masterstroke, socially transforming, and a brilliant long-term economic success. Collectivization as a disaster. Livestock population plummeted. Size of grain harvest fell. Collectivization as a human tragedy. Between the violence... Oh my god. Between the violence, deportations and famines, it is approximated that between 5 and 10 million lives were lost. Man-made famines in Ukraine is referred as Holodomor. Kind of sounds like Holocaust. Millions ended up living a desperate existence in Arctic and Siberian labor camps. Collectivization as a political success. Communist Party had full control of the countryside, private ownership was destroyed, peasants were now independent on the state as its employees, Ukrainian nationalism was destroyed. Collectivization transforming the countryside, dekulakization destroyed the previous rural social structure, weakened the influence of religion. Peasants lost their brief period of independence. Collectivization as an economic success. Grain procurements as a percentage of the harvest increased from 15% in 1928 to 32% in 1934, which is a massive jump in just 6 years. That's over double. Grain exports rose from 0.029 million tonnes in 1929 to 4.76 million tonnes in 1930 and 5.05 million tonnes in 1931. The process of industrialization. 1920s, Russia is predominantly agricultural. There were some major industrial centers in Moscow. NEP had stimulated some small-scale industry. However, Russia was almost a century behind the Western world in terms of industrialization. By World War I, the Soviet Union had become the second industrial power in the world behind USA. Industrialization was run by the State Planning Authority through Gosplan, State Planning Commission formed as part of Venska, in charge of production targets and setting guidelines. The economy changes from a mixed economy under the NEP to a command economy, a system where the government, rather than the free market, determines what goods should be produced. Under Gosplan, which meant the removal of much of the human element of the economic system. 5-year plans. The state took complete control of the economy. Central planning. What to produce, where and when to produce it, who would work where, and which sectors of the economy had priority. Plans set long-term targets and short-term targets for production. The plans were backed up by the law. It became a criminal offence to not meet targets set. Managers and individuals could be accused of sabotage or treason if targets weren't met. Those who exceeded targets were praised in the press and received bonuses. Central planning as a top-down process. The party established overall targets. Commissariats would work through regional administrators. These regional administrators would set specific targets for the enterprises. The first 5-year plan was extremely chaotic. Lack of coordination between the sectors of the economy. Party officials interfered with production. Managers were under enormous stress due to the possibility of arrest if targets weren't met. Shock brigades, groups of young workers used by the state to set an example of correct work habits and put pressure on other workers. Tremendous emphasis on heavy industry based on Western economic strength. Focus on enterprises of coal, iron ore, steel, oil, and transport. Prestige projects, building of the Dnieper Dam, the Moscow-Volga Canal, and the Moscow Underground Railway system. The lives of workers and ordinary Russians were tough in the extreme. There were opportunities for education, training, and bonuses. Labour discipline was harsh, and there were tough punishments for lateness, absenteeism, poor quality work, leaving without permission, and damaging equipment. By the late 1930s, an internal passport system was enforced to control workers' movements. Each worker had a labour book that documented work history, qualifications, mistakes, and poor disciplines. Living standards plummeted. The government implemented forced labour, and many kulaks, prisoners, and terror victims were sent to work in inhospitable conditions such as the Baltic White Sea Canal. Despite the problems faced, hardships experienced, mistakes made, and freedoms lost, the achievement of industrialization was impressive. Political transformation under Stalin. 3 key developments. The transformation of the Communist Party into a disciplined, obedient, hierarchical structure with Stalin at its apex. The introduction of arguably one of the world's most democratic constitutions, chaos and confusion at the lower levels and in more distant regions. The Stalinist constitution. It aimed to portray the outside world the victory of socialism. Found its expression in the 1936 Constitution, based on the assumption that the defeat of the kulaks meant that the internal class struggle was over and true socialist order could be constructed. Greatly extended the power of the federal government. Highly democratic features legitimized the notion of the one-party state. However, power of the Supreme Soviet, very limited, rarely met, and just rubber-stamped decisions already made by lighter organs of the state. Power remained in the hands of the Politburo. Stalin's role in the Soviet state. He dominated the ruling Communist Party. All owed their positions to the Great Helmsman, as Stalin was called in Soviet propaganda. He became the complete embodiment of the nation as a cult of personality was developed. Under his leadership, the Soviet Union attempted to transform itself into a modern, industrialized society. He had complete control over the secret police and the machinery of security and justice. All aspects of Soviet society came under Stalinist control. Foreign policy was determined by the wishes of Stalin. The purges. Thousands of party members stood accused of horrendous crimes. They were innocent yet confessed and accepted their fate. These were the show trials. Accused of everything from planning to assassinate Lenin and Stalin to wrecking economic enterprises, to being in contact with Trotsky or spying for Germans or Japanese. By the late 1920s, Stalin was purging to remove his opponents in the power struggle. In 1928, first of show trials occurred. Kulaks resisting and targets not being met. Scapegoats for these failures had to be found. The murder of Kirov. By 1934, gradual easing of pressure in the Soviet Union. Targets for second five-year plan eased and some concessions granted to peasants. The calm ended abruptly with the murder of Sergei Kirov on 1st of December 1934. He was popular in the party. The alleged assassination was Nikolaev, and it was a crime of passion and personal grievance. But in 1956, Khrushchev declared he was murdered on the orders of Stalin. What? Anyway, Stalin saw Kirov as a dangerous rival. Impacts. In March 1935, the Kirov decrees were announced and included the minimum age penalty lowered to 12. Parasites and anyone who knew a parasite were to be executed. Stalin demanded collective responsibility and called people to be on lookout for enemies of the people. Thousands were denounced by the NKVD. Atmosphere of fear gripped the nation. Next few years, wave of terror unleashed. Thousands of party members caught up in the hysteria, the great show trials of the 1930s. The Yezofishina, which is the Great Terror between 1937 and 1938. Terror of the late 1930s went far beyond grand show trials. In September 1936, Yagoda replaced Nikolai Yezhov. He spent 3 years in the secret police before he was caught up in the terror and shot. He was known as the bloodthirsty dwarf, inclined to sadistic pleasures. Let's get a picture of this guy. That's him. Doesn't really look like a dwarf. Is it? Anyway, interesting. He was inclined to sadistic pleasures, I already said that. The terror unleashed on the country in 1937 to 1938 carries his name. He drew up vast arrest lists. Local NKVD officers given quotas to fill, a fixed percentage would be executed. Innocence or guilt was irrelevant. The terror spread to all branches of the party, the economy, the arts, the armed forces. Key targets of the NKVD were party members, but thousands of ordinary people were sucked into the whirlpool of the purges. Anyone arrested and interrogated was able to provide the names of others to be arrested. Even close confidants of Stalin could become the victim. Many foreign communists in Russia also became targets. Trotsky was murdered in Mexico in 1940. Media campaigns launched exhorting people to seek out potential spies. People willing to come forward with names. Intellectuals, particular targets. The stats. 1 in 18 were arrested. Quotas of victims were laid down like production targets. There was no appeal and execution was immediate. 1934, 1 million arrested and executed from Leningrad and Moscow. By 1937, approximately 18 million sent to labor camps, 10 million died. By 1934, another 1 million shot. 1 to 2 million died in camps. Impacts of the terror. Everyone was living in fear. You didn't trust anyone. There was a massive loss of life. Expected population in 1937 was 180 million, but it ended up being 164 million, probably because they killed the amount of people that they were supposed to have. Just a guess. Terror totally transformed the Communist Party. In 1939, only 8% of party members had been members in 1920. So people weren't staying around, or they were being kicked out through these show trials. 75% of party members who joined between 1921 and 28 had been eliminated. It was now a young party. Nearly entire party and its ownership owed careers to Stalin. Nature of secret police changed. By late 1930s, secret police no longer controlled by party. Only Stalin stood above it. Ooh, that's not good. Non-Russian groups through Soviet Union suffered enormously. NKVD systematically removed leadership of non-Russian groups. Rigorous Russification policies. The armed policies were catastrophically impacted. Oh my god. The armed forces were catastrophically impacted. Massive purge of the leadership of the armed forces. Political consolidation. Purges left vacancies. These were filled by Stalin supporters, the nomenclatura, who enjoyed enormous privileges, allowed Stalin to shape the party to his liking. It was characteristic of Stalin to have his own allies marked by their subordinates. In Stalin's system, identical thugs kept replacing each other, like so many Russian dolls. That was said by some guy called Stone. This was Stalin's political victory over the party. Shapiro. Social and cultural change in the USSR under Stalin. Women. The November Revolution, there was a genuine desire within the party to achieve equality for women. Lenin supported efforts of Commissar of Social Welfare, Alexandra Kollontai. Women made significant gains in the early Bolshevik government. In January 1918, they were given civil, legal, and electoral equality. Equality in marriage and divorce by consent. Abortion was legalized. Women allowed to be combatants in civil war. 1920, Bolsheviks women's section formed. They were given wider education opportunities and encouraged to join the workforce. However, Russia did not lose deep-seated male chauvinism overnight. Kollontai died a disappointed woman as the revolution she hoped for never eventuated. Under Stalin, revert to more conservative values. 1930s was a period of massive upheavals with millions of workers on the move, with social ramifications. The birth rate was falling, the crime levels in little juveniles was rising, Soviet cities inundated with large numbers of homeless children. Changes made an official approach to women known as the Great Retreat. A more serious attitude to marriage now demanded, and children were to be taught respect and obedience. 1936, the government introduced a family code. These hardline policies began to affect domestic issues. From 1935, the NKVD became involved in dealing with juvenile crime. NKVD attempted to clear the streets of homeless children and place them in orphanages. Parents fined if their children were guilty of juvenile crime and could have their children taken away from them. Limitations. For vast majority of Soviet women in 1930s, issue of ideology and concern about the place of women were more or less irrelevant. What mattered was getting through the daily grind of feeding and clothing their children, coping in cramped living spaces, and achieving some sort of tolerance of neighbours in communal apartments. Even professional women could not escape the daily grind of domestic duties imposed upon them. Education. Late 20s Cultural Revolution. Young people encouraged to criticise bourgeois values and discover their revolutionary self and proletarian values. Gonna continue in the next video. So I'm going to be talking about culture and arts. Censorship. Censorship was not always heavy-handed. The party ensured that a positive image of the regime was prominent, and details of any shortcomings in industrialization or brutality of collectivization did not appear in the media. Great publicity given to the purges, late 1930s, but most NKVD activity was kept under the radar. There was censorship of the arts. Censorship was not always clear-cut. It was difficult for party officials to know what to do. For example, in the first decade of Bolshevik rule, religion was limited. Religion was limited tolerance. It was tolerated not very much. I don't know. However, from 1929, a new militancy appeared as churches were closed down and priests arrested. The backlash. A militant campaign eased, and regime could claim it was not involving such things in the first place. Caused problems for officials as they could not be informed of policy change. Religion. Churches and organised religions condemned. League of Militant Atheists established in 1925, with a membership of over 5 million in the 30s. There could be no commitment to any other god. Priests were arrested and many were executed. I've definitely already said that. The youth. While not at school learning useful things and the correct views of the past, students were forced into the Komsomol, the communist leagues, where they were taught about Marxist thinking, maintained healthy bodies, and learnt to love Stalin. Originally independent of the Communist Party, but by Stalin's time it had come under party control. Membership was voluntary, but failure to join could be used against a person as evidence of a lack of support for communist ideals. Lack of membership could make it difficult for those to obtain essential, hard-to-get things. Membership can be seen as a form of blat. Blat is a system of corruption and bribery that develops in order to get the essential things that a person would need. Membership made one, by definition, an activist. Komsomol members would volunteer to assist the party or state organisation, evident in their involvement in the grain procurement during collectivization and the anti-religious campaigns of the 1930s. They had their own uniform. Activism had an appeal for many Komsomol members who had great enthusiasm for the idealistic goals of the regime. An element of activism was to expose any abuses they discovered in the bureaucracy, for example, Katia Ivanova. Not always viewed in a positive light by ordinary Soviet citizens, and their activities often resented. Religious believers referred to the Thai pioneers as the devil's noose, and physical attacks on young activists occurred. They were seen by citizens as the regime's favoured and privileged few. Ellie, what are you doing? Common for young Komsomol members to report their parents for the anti-party behaviour. For example, Polik Morozov reports his dad for having extra grain. Dad gets sent to a gulag and then is executed. So Polik's grandfather kills him for reporting him. So clearly it didn't work out, and a lot of pain for no gain. Many activists involved themselves in an unmasking, a stigma attached to a person from a previously bourgeois or upper class background, and many Soviet citizens made efforts to create a proletarian or peasant background. Concealment of one's class became a crime. Unmasking could result in loss of work, food, housing, promotion, and other essentials of life. Youth idealists. For some young people, Soviet rule inspired genuine idealism, which went far beyond the exhaustions of the regime. They sought to do more than obey party dictates. They wanted to create a new way of life based on true socialist principles. Small groups began to experiment with ideology in a practical way and live on socialist principles. They shared living space, earnings, money, and possessions. Domestic tasks would be rusted. By late 1920s, Komsomol estimated that over 50,000 people living in this manner, and as young people became... By late 1920s, Komsomol estimated that over 50,000 people were living in this manner, and as young people became involved in 5-year plans, this number expanded. Oh, it did make sense. This idealism was not to survive the era of the purges and the war. Limitations. Not all youth enthusiastically embraced the regime. Between December 1933 and May 1934, police came across several counter-revolutionary groups such as the Society for the Rebirth of Russia. In Voronezh, police came under Police came across groups supporting Trotskyism and fascism in high schools. One school had swastikas painted on its walls. Impact of youth homelessness at the time. Cult of personality. 1930s cult of personality reached unbelievable levels. Necessary to provide a unifying figure for the Soviet Union. Deliberate fixation of an individual dedication and loyalty to an all-powerful leader. Ever-present image. Posters and paintings of Stalin in every home. School, shop, factory, peasant's hut, museum, government office. Any building capable of hanging a picture had a picture of Stalin. It was impossible to pick up a newspaper without seeing Stalin on the front page. No visit to cinema possible without seeing a newsreel praising his visionary leadership. Any public celebration would have people carrying massive portraits of Stalin. Image of Stalin in 1930s varies. Early images presented as humane and understood people's needs, not a remote, distant figure. Often represented as a man who was intimately involved in the lives of his people. Many images of Stalin were children. In the late 1930s, the image had changed. Stalin represented a man of wisdom. He was seen discussing issues with Lenin, instructing party workers in meetings. As a young man, instructing his friends, more heroic and sometimes detached and superior. Paintings and movies produced depicted Stalin as a great Civil War hero, a lone leader, the great helmsman, guiding the ship of state through troubled waters. Stalin's words were everywhere. Newspaper editions vied with each other to see who could include the most quotations and references to Stalin. Stalin's role in the past was steadily built up over time and at the expense of other leading Bolsheviks, especially Trotsky. Trotsky was written out of Soviet history books. Not only were Stalin's defeated rivals written out of history, they were even just airbrushed from history, so they were just completely removed. It was like they never really existed. Leading party figures who were no longer in favour were removed from photographs. Soviet foreign policy. The nature of Soviet foreign policy, 1917 to 1941. So we've got some key periods. So 1970 to 1921, revolutionary pragmatism or consolidation. There was a response to their need for survival. In the 1920s, making friends. In the 1930s, there was a search for security. An overview. Soviet Union foreign policy by conflicting positions. Soviet foreign policy highly contradictory and multifaceted. On the same day, they could make totally contradictory pronouncements. Revolutionary position versus traditional approach. These conflicting approaches fragmented policy from mid-1920s and onwards. So I've got in brackets United Front versus Popular Front. Rise of Nazism and fascism saw a significant shift in Soviet foreign policy as it saw itself being threatened. League of Nations, treaty with France and Czechoslovakia. Great Britain and France, slow to move against Hitler, allowed him to move eastwards. He was a threat to the USSR. Munich Conference of 1938 was the final straw. Revolutionary versus traditional foreign policy approaches. On the one hand, it was a revolutionary state. The mission was to spread the word of Marxism-Leninism, and incite socialist revolutionaries in other countries to achieve utopia of worldwide classless and stateless communism. Lenin predicted constant state of war between the Soviet Union and other capitalist countries. Established Comintern in 1919 to assist communist revolutionaries in various countries. Did not attend Paris Peace Conference 1919 and did not join the League of Nations. However, Soviet Union soon acting as a typical state. Hoped for revolution but did not eventuate. Had become a state with no alternative but to coexist with capitalist states. Whilst Comintern doing its best to destroy the governments of Britain, France and Germany, the Soviet Commissariat of Foreign Affairs was doing its best to develop cordial relationships. Once socialism in one country had become official thinking, the capitalist West was needed for trading capital. Ideology was to be sacrificed to national state interests. Revolutionary pragmatism / consolidation, 1917 to 21. One aim in 1917 to 21, survival. All foreign policy actions aimed in this direction. Lenin's first actions concerned the war with Germany. Adamant that war with Germany had to come to an end and was willing to pay any price to achieve this, as we could see in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Threats from allies and Western governments clear in their intentions. The strangling of Bolshevism at its birth would have been an untold blessing to the human race. That was a quote by Winston Churchill. Making friends, this was during the 1920s. Victory in civil war brought survival, but world revolution now a distant dream. 1920s dominated by attempts to normalize foreign relations. Ideological changes at home ensured this, and the need to revive the Soviet economy. The 1920 Friendship Treaty signed with immediate neighbours, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and in 1921, Turkey, Persia, and Afghanistan. 1921 commercial agreement signed with Britain and Italy. 1923 to 24, some diplomatic relations with Britain. By 1930, had relations with all great powers except US, and attending League of Nations conferences. Making friends, the 1920s Soviet-German relations. Great diplomatic success was relationship with Germany. Germany and Soviet Union had much in common, both pariah states, scorned by the Treaty of Versailles and League of Nations. Germany helped Soviet Union during the 1921 famine. German army head Hans von Seeckt contacted Trotsky for the German-Soviet military cooperation. By early 1922, German army making military groups, banned from TOV and exercising its troops in Soviet Union, while also training Red Army forces, formally came together in 1921 Treaty of Rapallo. 1922 Treaty of Rapallo. Rapallo. Claims each had for reparation and compensation was cancelled. Diplomatic relations restored. Granted the other most favoured nation status. Article 5 stated each power promised to cooperate in a spirit of goodwill to meet each nation's economic interests. Was clearly a marriage of convenience. The two powers were worlds apart ideologically. For the Soviet Union, it was a triumph, as diplomatic isolation had been broken. It secured for the Soviet Union its first official recognition by a great power. Soviet-German relations obstacles. Hurt in 1923 following abortive communist coup in Germany. Stresemann moved Germany closer to the west with the Treaty of Locarno and their entry into the League of Nations. These developments did not stop German-Soviet trade treaty being signed in 1925 and a neutral treaty in 1926. Economic ties strengthened and Russiaaa continued its clandestine activities inside the Soviet Union. 1930s search for security. With onset of Great Depression, ambiguity of Soviet foreign policy reappeared. Capitalism was facing collapse and briefly revived hopes of world revolution. Through Comintern, Stalin ordered communist parties in Western countries to break links with moderate socialist parties. Disaster as it weakened opposition to the rise of fascism, particularly the case in Germany. Had the SPD and KPD worked together, it might have been possible to prevent the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. However, the antagonistic policy was accompanied by Soviet desire to sell its surplus grain to Western powers in order to finance a massive drive towards industrialization. By mid-1920s, Soviet foreign policy changed direction. Stalin saw dangers to the Soviet Union of the growth of Nazi expansionism in Europe and Japanese militarism in Far East. When Hitler signed a 10-year non-aggression pact with Poland in 1934, fears of joint Polish-German military action in the Ukraine seemed real. Single, most important foreign policy aim for Stalin at this point was avoidance of war. Going through collectivization and industrialization, no condition to fight a war possibly in East and West. Hitler made no secret for his detestation for the Soviet regime. Hitler made Soviet Union was a country of inferior Slavs governed by Jewish Bolsheviks. Dreams of Lebensborn meant destruction of Soviet power and enslavement of Russian people. Consequently, Stalin ordered Western communist parties to forget World Revolution and cooperate with anti-fascist groups. 7th Comintern Congress, July 1935, ordered them to join Popular Front governments where appropriate. Such a Popular Front government was formed in France in 1936. Soviet Union now attempted to forge ties with non-communist nations to forge a united bloc against the threat of Nazism. Steps to form a united bloc against Nazism. 1932, a treaty of friendship signed with Italy. It was short-lived. Mussolini later signed an anti-Comintern pact with Hitler. What a dog. 1933, Soviet Union and United States established diplomatic relations. 1934, Soviet Union joined League of Nations. 1935, Soviet Union and France signed an allegiance. 1935, also Czechoslovakia joined Franco-Soviet combination. 1936, Communists joined the Popular Front government in France. 1936 to 1939, Stalin strongly backed the Republican anti-fascist forces in Spanish Civil War. Next we have the Nazi-Soviet Pact, August 1939. So pretty much everything that I just said was kind of thrown out the window for this pact. August 23, 1939. Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia signed one of the most incredible documents in diplomatic history, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. Stalin realized by late 1938 his hopes of forming a united front with the West against the threat of Nazism was going to fail. In Western ruling circles, Nazism seen as a lesser evil than Bolshevism. Britain Prime Minister Chamberlain in May 1939 said, "I must profess profound distrust of Russia. Soviet Union was isolated and vulnerable. Convulsions going on inside the country not helping. These were like purges, etc. Efforts to forge military ties with the West came to nothing. Fears increased when Germany, Japan and Italy came together in the Anti-Comintern Pact, September 1937. This was the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis. Chamberlain pursuing a policy of appeasement. A high point of appeasement came September 1938 at the Munich Conference. Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain and Daladier met to carve up Czechoslovakia and gave Hitler the Sudetenland area. Czech and Soviet Union not invited to attend the conference. The view from Moscow was that Western powers were driving Hitler eastwards and hoping for a struggle between fascism and communism, in which would destroy the other. Coming to the agreement. Stalin began to think about coming to an agreement with Hitler. March 1939, Germany invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. This was the end of appeasement. Britain warns that if Hitler attacks Poland, they would declare war against Germany. Hitler wanted Poland, but wanted to avoid war on two fronts. Hitler too now began to think about an agreement with the Soviet Union. Stalin and Hitler both opportunists, neither trusted the other, but an agreement suited them both. The agreement. There was benefits for both sides. If neither finds itself in war, the other will not support the third power. Takes immediate effect. Hitler wanted to keep his deadline to attack Poland. Secret protocols added. Soviet Union allowed to take a number of territories. The impact. Germany invaded Poland. Russia occupied eastern Poland. 1940, Soviet Union occupied territories stipulated in the secret protocols. After the Nazi-Soviet Pact, this was September 1939 to June 1941. Hitler had no intention of actually honouring the pact. Stalin must have known, but right until May 1941 continued to keep his side of the bargain and sent materials to Germany, until only weeks before German invasion, in June 1941. Following the defeat of Poland, a period of phony war continued until April 1940, when there was no military action in Europe. Then Hitler attacked Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg and France. By June all had been defeated. 1940 to 41 had also consolidated his position in Eastern Europe. He was now ready to take on Russia. Flashback to 1939, when the Soviet Union attacked Finland, who refused Soviet territorial demands. The Winter War, as it became known, was humiliating for the Soviets. It inflicted several defeats on Russia, but Finland was eventually defeated. Cost for Stalin had been high. By 1941, the Soviet Union had consolidated its position by annexing Baltic states and Bessarabia, and has engaged in massive rearmament drive. This was the position where Germany invaded Russia on the 22nd of June 1941 in Operation Barbarossa. That is conflict in Europe. Study it. Soviet foreign policy in the Far East. Threats from West not only concerned the Soviet Union in 1930s, also potential of conflict with Japan in the East. In 1931, Japan attacked Manchuria and violated Soviet rights on the Chinese Eastern Railway. Soviet Union in no position to act against Japan in Manchuria, and even offered a non-aggression pact which Japan refused. The Soviet Union established links with the nationalist regime in China. Following Japan's attack on China, 1937, Soviet advisors sent to help the nationalist Chinese forces that were now fighting alongside Chinese communist forces. I don't think that made sense. Soviet-Japanese clashes along their common border between 1937 to 39 resulted in major Japanese setbacks. Japanese expansion now directed southwards. Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact signed in April 1941. Oh my god. Alright, now I'm going to talk about the role of ideology in Soviet foreign policy 1917 to 41. The dominant theme in Soviet foreign policy 1917 to 41 was the promotion of national state interest, domestic concerns, and the desire to protect the Soviet future determined policy. The domestic ideological debate only reinforced the national interest line. National interest takes precedence at all times, informs the changing ideology debate, informs Soviet Union foreign policy. Ideological, yes, the critical of old diplomacy and secret treaties. Repudiation of debts, withdrawal from imperialist war, formation of Comintern, support of socialist governments in Spain, support of socialist parties in other countries post-1933. Nazi-Soviet pact was the only option available. What's not ideological? Traditional foreign policy largely influenced nationalist self-interest aimed at increasing power and safeguarding security. Examples: withdrawal from World War I was practical as it was so unpopular. Ideology outdated when realised there would be no worldwide revolution. Hitler's coming to power demanded pragmatic search for security. Nazi-Soviet pact was practical and contained a secret treaty. Revolutionary years. What? Okay, we're going to talk about domestic issues and revolutionary years. I have no idea. This is not my table. Alright, Bolshevik consolidation. Sorry, this is under Revolutionary Years column. Just open up the doc. It's going to be much easier if you don't understand. Revolutionary Years. Bolshevik consolidation of power. 1917, October Revolution. Popular plus coercive measures. End World War I at all costs. Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. 1918 to 21, the Civil War. War communism produced economic humanitarian catastrophe. Famine and agricultural production plummets. Kronstadt Revolution 1921. The NEP 1921. In the 1920s, national recovery need for stability. These are domestic issues in the 1920s. Oh, that makes a lot more sense. So before I was talking about the domestic issues in the revolutionary years, now I'm going to talk about the 1920s and their domestic issues. National recovery needed for stability. The NEP was in place. This was a retreat from socialism. Impacts of consolidation of power. Intra-party ideological debates. Trotsky's permanent revolution fails to garner support. Stalin's socialism in one country more accurately captures national mood. Defeat of left means Soviet national economic development has priority over ideology. Treaty defeated in struggle for power and expulsion from party. End of any fanning of revolution in the West. 1930s. Collectivization and industrialization. The Great Terror and purges. Soviet state is weak and vulnerable. Countryside is torn apart. The aims of the revolutionary years. Beginning of revolution. Bolshevik aspired for global revolution. Revolutionary idealism. Soon replaced by aim for survival of the regime. Revolutionary pragmatism. Now we've got the aims of the 1920s. To defend itself as the only communist nation in a capitalist world by establishing cooperative relations with capitalist governments. Establish trade links. Now we've got aims of the 1930s. Collective security. Could not afford to be isolated. Prolong war as much as possible. Needed time to rebuild. Avoid a two-front war. Could not sustain this during period of weakness. The strategies of the revolutionary years. Revolutionary idealism. Global revolution. Traditional foreign policy would not be relevant in a communist world. Comintern established in 1919. Comintern activities caused many problems for Soviet government, did not join League of Nations and did not attend the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, call for immediate end to imperialistic war. Peace at all costs. Revolutionary pragmatism. Soon became clear that global revolution would not happen and new government needed to survive as only communist nation in a capitalist world. More realistic to adopt a policy of cooperation. This was carried out by the Commissariat of Foreign Affairs. Geez, they did a lot. No intention of launching a revolutionary war against the West. NEP required trade with surrounding capitalist states. Strategies of the 1920s. Pursued a more traditional approach to foreign policy. Established relations with capitalist governments. 1920 friendship treaties signed with immediate neighbours Finland, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. 1921 Turkey, Persia, Afghanistan. 1921 commercial agreements with Britain and Italy. Soviet-German relations formalised in 1922 Treaty of Rapallo. 1923 to 24 some diplomatic relations with Britain. By 1930 had relations with all great powers except the US. Attending League of Nations conferences. Brief change. 1929 onset of Great Depression. Capitalist system in trouble. Stalin orders Comintern to avoid cooperation with other political parties. Fascist regimes welcome. The strategies of the 1930s, and we're almost done. Creative alliances for defense. December 1933, Soviet Foreign Minister, the ensuring of peace cannot depend on our efforts alone. It required the collaboration and cooperation of other states. Comintern gave up its revolutionary policies and encouraged communists to create popular fronts with moderate socialists. Final Comintern Congress held in 1939 wanted to improve relations with the Nazi regime, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. Formed defensive alliance with France and Czech 1935. Established diplomatic ties with US and joined League of Nations conferences. League of Nations, in 1934. Intervention in Spanish Civil War. United bloc against Nazism. Following Japan's attack on China 1937, Soviet advisors sent help to nationalist Chinese forces. Role of ideology in the revolutionary years. At first, ideology does play a considerable role in guiding foreign policy. 1917 to 18, there was a genuine hope for outbreaks of revolution in Germany and Western nations. There was a desire to export communism. Evident in establishment of Comintern, not joining League of Nations and not attending Paris Peace Conference. However, this idealism is quickly overshadowed by the need for survival, the Civil War, etc. Oh my god, therefore did not actively pursue global revolution and can perceive signing of Treaty of Brest-Litovsk as betrayal of ideology. Thus, ideology certainly has not been discarded, but not a dominant force in early years of consolidation, competing with national state interest and need for survival. Next, we have the 1920s role of ideology. Promotion of traditional foreign policies signals a substantial departure from original Bolshevik ideology, but aligns with Stalinist ideology. Socialism in one country. However, brief reappearance in 1929 with onset of Great Depression. Fans the flames of ideological fervour, but still does not actively pursue and more preoccupied with its internal economic development. Despite the brief reappearance of ideology in 1929, national state interest profoundly dominates foreign policy in this period. The 1930s role of ideology. Second last part of this thing. By this time, ideology has been completely discarded in favour of protecting Soviet national interest. Ideology has ceased to have any relevance to foreign policy. The defence and security of the nation is paramount. Ideological goals purely confined to domestic. Construction of socialism at home, which requires peace in Europe. The overall foreign policy aims. 1. Export revolution. Began to lay the foundations to achieve this, but did not actively pursue it. This aim was soon replaced by socialism in one country due to the realization that it was not to actualize. Achieve collective security. Made some significant gains in terms of establishing treaties and alliances, which provided some temporary confidence. Overall failed as Allied powers still favoured Nazi Germany over Soviet Russia and establishment of anti-Comintern Pact non-aggression pacts not honoured. Avoid/prolong the major war. This was the third and final aim. Managed to pacify threats in the east, somewhat delay Nazi attack. But Nazis were able to attack according to their schedule and at a time when Soviet Union was still weak and unprepared for war. Smash your exams.